Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healing Ties 2.0, featured on the Whole Care Network. And we want to welcome all of our listeners from the United Kingdom and beyond who are listening to Healing Ties 2.0 via UK Health Radio, the world's #1 talk health radio. I am so thrilled to be back on UK Health Radio with new episodes of Healing Ties. I'm your host, presenter, Christopher McClellan. You just might know me as the Bowtie Guy. On Healing Ties 2.0, we visit with caregivers from all over the globe who share their stories, because it's through story sharing where diversity meets the road to collaborate on a common cause. And our common cause is supporting caregivers before, during, and after caregiving ends. Caregiving is just not a local issue. It's a universal issue that brings people together from diverse backgrounds. And we believe the best information and referral comes from one caregiver to another. So, if you'd like to share your story on Healing Ties, email me direct at thebowtieguy@healingties.com. On this episode of Healing Ties, we feature Mike Estewine and Christina Best. Now, Mike is the CEO of Caregiving and Caregiving.com, and Christina is the executive editor at Caregiving.com. Caregiving is a communication app for caregivers to help manage their caregiving day, and Caregiving.com is a vital resource for caregivers across the globe. Let's join the conversation with Mike and Christine and learn how they are creating healing ties by their words, actions, and deeds. Greetings, Christina and Mike, and welcome to another episode of Healing Ties 2.0. It is great to visit with both of you today.
You as well, Chris. It's going to be interesting being interviewed by my co-host.
That's right, because we do a podcast called How Did We Got Here? And then we've got Mike with us today as well.
Yeah, I'm a rookie to the podcast game.
You're not a rookie.
Try to get on our level, Mike.
I'm trying. I am. I'm writing, taking vigorous notes. They can't see, so I could be doing anything right now.
You could be doing anything. We're going to get into the big time before the end of the year and do video podcast.
Ooh. I'm ready for it.
Spice it up.
I might have to comb my beard, though.
You have a beard?
Maybe because it's too white, and maybe you just can't see it.
I thought it was an exposure setting or something.
And your shirt is white today, too, so
my shirt is white today. Probably because of all the sunshine in Florida. We're real excited with the reboot of Healing Ties 2.0, and now we're back on ukhealthradio.com. Johan invited me back to the #1 talk health station, and I wanted to introduce our listeners in the UK to Caregiving.com and Carolee and my good friends Christina and Mike. I'm asking all my guests, how are you guys creating healing ties?
You go first, Christina.
If I go first, I'm going to be speaking about myself personally, maybe less so about the brands, but I do bring my personal philosophies into my role, of course, at Caregiving.com as editor-in-chief. You know, I think my answer is simple as I reflected on my year-long journey so far into this role. And I think back to my first counseling appointment years ago, and I seem to remember my counselor asking me some question like, what do you like about yourself? Or what do you think is good about who you are? And I remember saying that I create safe spaces for people. And I think that's something that I try to bring to my role every single day at Caregiving.com, to our the people I work with, to our contributors, to our overarching caregiver community, is this idea of creating safe spaces where I'm providing hopefully a judgment-free space where you feel comfortable to reach out to me, where you feel comfortable to share your story, where you feel comfortable to connect with me for advice. You know, one of the most meaningful parts of my job is working with our contributors, who are all these wonderful folks who support caregivers, whether they're consultants or they're social workers. They just have a sincere desire to help caregivers. And in my role, what I'm able to do is take the knowledge and information in their brains that they put on paper and make it the best that it can be. And I get a lot of joy in being able to support our contributors specifically in that way. And I've gotten so much positive feedback from them on making them sound so good in the best way that they can.
That to me too, it's the idea of you saying safe spaces. Like I really like that concept, especially in Christina's role as editor-in-chief of caregiving.com. I think it's so important that she have that mindset, because one of the things we've always strived for at caregiving.com, and just in the last 10 years of working in this space, there's so much vulnerability associated with caregiving. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges people often point to with caregiving, is that you have to become vulnerable and you have to be able to ask for help and do these things. It's one of the hardest things to overcome. And so for us with caregiving.com, and especially in Christina's role, making sure that that can occur, that people can be vulnerable and feel safe in that vulnerability on our site, it's by far and away one of the most important things we strive for. And so it's super exciting to hear her say that's one of her strengths, because it's ultimately what we want to translate right into her work and how the site makes you feel. Because there's a lot of prescriptive caregiving stuff out there on the internet.
Right.
There's a lot of to-dos and lists and here's how you do this. But from our perspective, there's not a lot of how do you feel? Like, are you okay right now?
Mm-hmm.
And we want you to feel that way, because ultimately you have to be first okay before you can be better. So that's cool. That's cool to hear.
I think, too, part of that is not just the vulnerability and feeling like we've created a space where you can be vulnerable, but I would say also the flip side of that, creating a space where you can also set boundaries. That's something that's come across in my work several times, where someone's asked me not to publish something or says, I'm not comfortable with that. And again, me personally receiving that information and saying, I completely respect where you're coming from, and that's okay if you're not comfortable sharing your story in this way or this bit of information. That's okay too.
What's great for me to be connected with the two of you is I originally shared our story on caregiving.com, and to come back full circle to be present with the two of you and see what the opportunities you're providing people to continue to share their stories. Because, Christina, it's right. You're vulnerable when you share your stories. Mm-hmm. And it's a raw emotion when caregivers are able to write and share with others, because it's a comfortable space.
And I think historically, just what caregiving.com has been over the past 20 years or so that it's been around is that safe space. And so, as I said, me taking on this role a year ago, I recognized what a privilege that was. And I've just tried my best every day to continue to express that value or show that value in the way that I conduct myself and the way that I help produce content for the site or help facilitate the production of content for the site.
It's interesting I'm not dodging the question, I promise. I'll give you how am I creating Heal and Tie's answer.
I've got it marked down here to get back to that sooner or later. So.
When we first decided to sort of partner with caregiving.com and sort of bring that under our umbrella and sort of make it the most public-facing extension of the company, we felt a pretty significant responsibility to that community. And I Christina, I think, would absolutely agree. We are very much in the early days of our journey with caregiving.com, and what we really want to accomplish, we're just barely scratching the surface, I think, with the technology and some of the other things we're going to bring to it. But a lot of the work we've done early on is really just trying to understand how we can improve the organic community experience there. Right. Like you mentioned, Chris, you shared your story on caregiving.com years ago, and you were engaged in that community for years prior to us ever even knowing about it. And there's thousands of folks just like you who've shared and trusted caregiving.com to sort of be that safe space. Right. It's critical for us, and it's critical for a person like Christina to be involved at the head of that organization, because you have to entrust someone there in order to keep that meaningful piece of it alive and to ensure that it stays intact as we move and do all the things that we want to do with it to drive change and to improve caregiving experiences around the world. So how do I give healing ties? I started this journey 10 plus years ago. I like to consider myself a pretty young guy, um, 36 years old. So 10 years ago, I was 26, which to me is so crazy to think about right now. Like that person who started this company 10 years ago versus me today, mind blowing. It's just crazy to think about because the one thing that has not changed even back then with that young, dumb kid who started this company was that I just felt like the connection between caregivers was holding the industry back. It was the sort of the connection between each other that wasn't being enabled efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
And so the ability for us as caregivers to share with one another, hey, how's our loved one doing today? Who saw them last? Who's going to see them next? Those things weren't being answered for me personally as a caregiver. So I felt like we needed to create that connection. And it's that theme of connecting people around a loved one has been at the heart of everything we've done and everything we've focused on for the last 10 years. So whether it's been in long-term care or it's been in hospice as senior living or at home and home-based care settings, that's ultimately what we've tried to strive for is connecting people around a loved one. And to me, I think that's sort of where my passion lies is how do we enable more of that, whether it be through the community, as Christina mentioned before, how do we create more spaces for people to connect and feel comfortable connecting
Right.
and sharing, to how do we use technology at the heart, at our DNA, we are a technology company. So how do we use technology to enable more efficient connections, safer connections, drive better outcomes, whether it be through a more positive experience or through a better health outcome? It's all about connections for me. So I think for me, how do I drive healing ties? I think that's enabling better communication and connection to happen across the sort of the caregiving landscape.
And it's very important as I look back and thinking about when I first started writing about caregiving. And we're going back, oh goodness, 11 years now. Technology has changed so much since then.
Yeah.
And it is better used for caregivers, but it still does come back down to the comfort of sharing the story.
Mm-hmm. So I'll tell a funny anecdote, funny story. So when I first started this company, I was traveling around my area for the audience that we're speaking to. I live in the United States in an area called Ohio, the Midwest. So I was traveling around my home within about an hour drive in every direction, trying to meet with every care home that I could to share with them this amazing tool that I was building. And I met with one organization. They invited me into the boardroom. They had all of the executive leadership there, except the CEO hadn't gotten there yet. But the chief operating officer or whoever it was, she said, hey, why don't you just go ahead and get started? Our CEO will join us shortly. So I get 30 minutes through this presentation. I'm wearing a cheap suit, the only suit I had at the time. And I get through, and all of a sudden, door swings open, mid-sentence of mine, door swings open. It's this CEO, this old guy, heavy set, sort of wobbles in, starts talking, he's sort of shaking hands of his colleagues, just oblivious to me talking in the middle of this presentation. Sits down and goes, "What's this about?" "Oh, hey, nice to see you. Glad you can make it. I'm Mike, and I'm presenting Care Monster," was the name of the company at the time. So this guy sits down, takes one look at this beautiful presentation I had built for them, slaps it down on the table and goes, "Our families don't use smartphones. This isn't ever going to work." And he sat back in his chair, turned back up to the presentation and asked me to continue. So 15 minutes later, the funnier part of the story is 15 minutes later, he falls asleep in the meeting and is just out cold. It's awkward because now the rest of the team is looking at me like, "I guess you just continue. Our boss isn't listening anymore anyway, but whatever." So that meeting ends. But to your point, that was like 8 years ago. And we had in senior living, we had executive leaders from some of the largest organizations in the country saying, "Our families don't use smartphones. Our families don't use this type of technology. Why would we ever do this?" To today, you're sort of seeing the exact opposite of that, whereas if it's not an app, we're not interested, or it's got to have an app or our families aren't going to use it. That mindset shift has happened so dramatically just in this short time that we've started or I've been involved in it. So it's been really remarkable.
And caregiving is not only an emotional issue, it's a universal issue.
Oh,
There might be cultural differences, but that's really across the board. But the issue of caregiving and caregivers, this is a worldwide issue that every community really has to deal with.
Yeah, I think the concept of care is, as you said, is universal, but I think that the way that different societies choose to perceive it probably depends on whether they are more collective or driven by community, or if they're individualistic, which I think is where we're at, for better or worse, is the U.S. And this is something that's come up in several of our conversations for how we got here, is we have a long-term care problem. And a lot of that, well, some of that probably has to do with, our focus on youth and ageism. But I think another part of that just has to do with our perception of caring for one another and how much responsibility we feel that we have to each other.
it's interesting. When we started the company, we immediately, as a startup, you dream of international and going global with the product. And because technology can exist cross-border and cross-ocean, there's no real barrier to entry. So we started exploring other markets, and one of the markets that was sort of readily available to us was Latin America, because of some of the relationships we've got and friends in Mexico and Costa Rica. And we started exploring those markets, and if you know anything about our product, it sort of hinges on the fact that people and families are spread out. Right. And they can use our product to more easily communicate with one another over great distances. In the US, that's a very real thing. People are often in different cities from one another. Well, in Latin America, Mexico, it's not that way at all. So when you're caring for someone, you're typically doing it in your home. And so as people age, they're typically bringing their mothers and their fathers back into their home if they were out already. Multi-generational housing in Latin America is very real. It's very prevalent. And so when we went to that market, we realized we don't really have a market here, because as people were looking at our product, they were going, well, my mom is here and my brother's across the street and my sister's across the street. I don't need a mobile app to be able to communicate to them how mom is doing, because we all have dinner together every night. So it's interesting. Christina's point is very real. It's depending on the society and depending on the cultural. The caregiving is present, but it's also very perceived very differently.
Very differently, sure. But I think the one thing that's constant, and this is part of your solution, is the information sharing. Going back and forth from doctors or communities, having that one-stop shop where that information is stored that everybody can access makes the care experience just a little bit easier, no matter if you're across the street or 2 countries across or on the east or west coast of the United States.
I think even more specific to us, I think with caregiving.com now at the top of our organization, that does provide us with a much broader solution that we can apply to just about any caregiving setting. Whereas before, 5 years ago, when it was just a mobile app that we had called Carely, and we were in the caregiving space, maybe less broad, more specific, niche focused. Mm-hmm. Now, I think as you point out, we're really trying to make sure that we've got something for everyone, and are working diligently to make sure we can find contributors to help us broaden our solution base for as many different caregiving situations as we possibly can.
And now we're going across the pond.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
So, Mike, tell our listeners about the week that you spent living in a senior living community.
Sure. I laugh because we were talking about this morning, actually. This was a really unique opportunity 7 years ago for me as a new entrepreneur, knew nothing about long-term care, the space, and it's the inner workings of it. They actually invited me to come live at a care home local near me for a week. And so they opened up one of the rooms in the building, and I moved in for a week, and literally I became one of the residents there. Dining, all the activities, I basically participated as if I was one of the residents. And to this day, it was one of the most eye-opening and sort of impactful experiences I've ever had. Just absolutely one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had as an individual, as a human being, because of the emotional connection and what I learned and what I understood about the day-to-day. It was amazing. It was really amazing.
And putting yourself in that position, I would imagine, allowed you to not only connect with the other residents, but see how the staff interacted as well.
Yeah, for sure. It was really interesting. I did get to spend a little bit of time just shadowing staff members throughout the day and just getting a sense of where they're headed. Most of the time it was them just sort of taking me on to the next event so that I didn't miss anything. But yeah, it's a different world. And one of the things I was blown away by was just the community. You know, folks, how they sort of found their own little groups within the community setting, and it almost felt like high school in some ways. It was kind of clicky. The ladies at the bridge group were very protective of their table at lunchtime. You couldn't sit there. They almost didn't want me pulling up a chair because it would have messed up the feng shui of the table. But they did let me in and ask them some questions, and it ultimately ended up being everything really fun. But yeah, it's really interesting that sort of that idea of just going, what do you call it? Immersive, when you just sort of just throw yourself, you just throw yourself into that environment and cross your fingers and hope for the best. And you learn more in those settings than you do anywhere else. So it was really powerful for us as a company.
And I'm sure that's helped you as you developed both Carely and Caregiving.com. That personal experience, it's invaluable.
Yeah, there's no substitute for it. There's one story I'll even bring to this, that we were sitting down at lunch or dinner, I think it was, and we're sort of going around the table and people are sharing things with me. And this lady goes, "Oh, I have something. You're a technology person. You'll love this." And so she reaches over and she grabs her walker and opens up a little like cubby in it and pulls out a card, just like a birthday card. And she goes, "Check this out. Isn't it amazing?" And she hands me this card. And this is 2014. So for context, she hands me this card, and on the front and on the inside, it's got a collage of pictures of her grandchildren that her son had made. And she goes, "Can you believe they can do that? That they can take pictures and they can get them printed on a card?" And my first reaction was internally, I'm like, "Well, yeah, no duh. Like I can make this on my computer and power at home. Like this, what are you talking about?" But then as I look at her face, like looking for my reaction, I could tell it was like this was the most amazing thing she had ever seen. And then my sort of astonishment turned to sort of a little bit of sadness, because I realized that this thing was her only connection to the outside world. And the reason it was so meaningful to her is that the things we take for granted, like Facebook and Instagram and our immediate connection to everyone around us and all of the things that are going on everywhere in everyone's lives, is so simple and so automatic. She doesn't have that, or she didn't have that. And so this hard copy card was her version of Instagram, and she was so enamored with it.
Right.
And I can only imagine that card she probably to this day carries that around and shares it with folks. But again, it was those types of moments for me that were sort of like, you can't read this in a book. You can't read this in the paper. It's like having this experience with this woman at dinner at 4:30 p.m. was my sort of gateway. It was cool.
It's almost like you did an internship.
Yeah, for real. It was cool. The other really amazing thing was I got to live, it was like a different time zone. Dinner at 4:30, lights out at 6 p.m. Like, man, 7:30 p.m. and the place was a ghost town. Wild. Just wild. I had a lot of time to myself.
Valuable experience. And so Christina, I have to get Christina in here.
Always.
There's so many wonderful components about your work. And you've talked about it so vividly here earlier in the podcast. But there's one part that you didn't mention, because you have a caregiving experience yourself. And I think when you've been in the trenches, you have that sense a little bit more than what somebody may not have been a caregiver.
Yeah, I've been anticipating this question. So my dad had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, I believe, when he was 59, and I was in middle school, I want to say, when he was diagnosed. I don't think that my parents told me officially that was his diagnosis until sometime in high school. Understandably, I imagine it would be difficult to try to help a middle schooler make sense of what Parkinson's disease is and its progression. So I just always lived with the acknowledgement that my dad was sick and getting sicker. He retired probably when I was still in my early years of high school, and his mobility decreased year after year. And then I think the most profound, well, there are a couple of profound moments. I think that there are the moments in between that we shared, particularly once he was retired and my mom was still working, and I'd come home from high school and come home from classes and just talk to him about big picture stuff. I don't necessarily have any concrete memories off the top of my head or ever because I have a horrible memory, but I know that he would just listen to me, and as I'm exploring my thoughts, navigating young adulthood, he was there for me, and I cherish those moments, and that I could be a companion to him at that time when he was basically home most of the day, again, when my mom was working. So, profound moments in my caregiving experience that I'll never forget were one, in 2008, Thanksgiving. I come home for Thanksgiving break, and Sunday was planning to head back to school. And my dad, at that point in the progression of his illness, was having severe mobility problems, and we lived in a split level. My mom still lives in that home. So getting him out of bed and trying to get him up and down the stairs was really difficult. And so this was one of those days where he was just frozen and maybe wasn't interested in getting up either. And my mom ended up calling 911, or maybe the non-emergency number. And I remember the ambulance coming, and the last thing I saw is my dad being carried out by these EMTs. And, I head back to school, and my mom tells me he ended up getting life flighted. And then once he was at the hospital, he had a stroke. From that day on, that was his memory at that point was gone, and I started distancing myself, I think, emotionally from him at that point, because his long-term memory was spotty and okay, but short-term memory and things like that were a real challenge. So that was one part of my caregiving experience, as I said, that I'll never forget, that's impressed in my memory. Well, and part of that too, living in the dorms. I remember earlier that week, I lived on the second floor, and in the dorm I was in, first and third floor were boys and second floor was girls. And the guys that lived above us, the one guy would bounce a basketball at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which was annoying. And I talked to him about it numerous times and how inconsiderate it was, and he didn't care. But I remember after that situation with my dad, I walked upstairs because it was one of those, like Monday or Tuesday. I heard him bouncing his basketball, and I knocked on his door, and I said, "You're going to have to stop that. You wouldn't know this, but my dad had a stroke and was taken to the hospital yesterday," or whatever. And it's really inconsiderate of you to not be thinking about anybody but yourself. I told him off in some way, and then he had empathy, but apparently not before I had to pull out that experience. And then the other part of the experience I wanted to share too was the end of life experience. And really, as far as hands-on care, that was when I was the most involved in helping my mom. He was on hospice, I guess, leading up to that. So at this point in 2010, my dad was having issues with eating, like he was coughing a lot. And my mom, I think, knew it was aspirational pneumonia, but did not want to accept that reality, wasn't ready to, but she did eventually take him to the doctor and get confirmation. And so this is like going into 2011, my last semester of college, and my mom asks me in helping her make healthcare decisions, which was not something at the age of 20 going into 21 that I ever would have thought I'd have to be doing.
Right.
Like, the doctors told me that he either needs to get a feeding tube or needs to go on hospice. What do you think? I was like, Dad loves Jamocha shakes, so I don't think he would really appreciate not being able to have another Jamocha shake in his life. Things like that came up through that experience. And then once he was on hospice, I can't remember how many days he was on hospice, but I helped facilitate some of that end-of-life care, and it's not something I talk about a lot, but I think for the sake of this conversation is valuable to share, which is I helped my mom. I helped move his body side to side as she was changing him, and I helped feed him some iced tea. So I'm proud to have been able to be a part of those final moments in his life. Like you said, Chris, you don't know it unless you've gone through it. It's a very difficult experience, but also a very beautiful one. Sometimes I wish I hadn't experienced it so young, but I'm glad that I did, because it made a profound enough impact on me that I decided that this is what I wanted to make a career out of.
And what's so beautiful about you sharing your story, and it proves the point, that you're in a safe space and you're creating safe spaces just for folks like yourself, because things like this was not available 20 years ago, where caregivers, no matter if you're here in the United States or if you're in Europe, anywhere, it's our stories that bind us together and demonstrate that there is help out there and that the world is not as vast as we might think it is. It's through story sharing where diversity meets the road to collaborate on a common cause. And that's what we're doing today. We're collaborating on a common cause to provide caregivers with those three essential components they all need: validation, respite, and resources. And that's why the two of you are creating so much wonderful healing ties by the work that you're doing.
So through my experience being a young adult caregiver 10 years ago, you said 20 years ago there weren't resources for caregivers, Chris, as a whole. And I think probably the community of caregivers was much bigger than it had ever been in, let's say, 2010. But even like the millennial caregiving experience or the younger caregiver experience, I had no idea that there were even, if there were any resources out there that could have been available to me. My friends were a great support, but they, at the end of the day, didn't really know what I was going through. And I was very private about some parts of the experience.
Yeah, there's a lot of people in society that are the guy bouncing the basketball.
Right.
Yep.
You know, there's a lot of us out
so
there.
So glad that I could share that, by the way. My retribution, being able to share.
Do you remember his name by any chance?
No, but he knows who he is.
What room number was he in?
I don't know. Whatever one was above me.
Yeah, but honestly, I think it's a good analogy, because I think a lot of people, who knows what was going on in his head. Maybe he just was clueless, or maybe he was doing it intentionally because you annoyed him, or who knows. But let's assume that he just had no idea, that what he was doing was causing you any sort of annoyance or suffering. I think today there's a lot of people like that, and I think even there's a lot of caregivers like that there just isn't enough empathy right now until you get into this position yourself and you realize, like, oh my God, this is so hard. Like, this is so intense, and this is so hard and emotional, and like, balancing and juggling all that stuff. To Christina's credit, she took that personal experience and that pain and turned it into something that is mission driven, and it's powered 100% by passion, and everything we're doing every day is really to meet the Christinas where they are in their challenge, whatever caregiving challenge that they're currently going through, and to say, hey, listen, we're here for you. We may not have a solution. We're not going to be able to take away the fact that you're going to have to move your dad back and forth every day with your mom, and that's going to be so hard, and it's going to have profound impact to you and the rest of your life, but we're going to be here. And there's going to be other people here that can share in that experience with you and say, yeah, I was there, I'm there too. And I think that's a pretty meaningful thing. I feel pretty good about being able to do that every day.
Me too.
To know that you're not alone when you think that you are in this all by yourself. I'll ask my pat question that I ask everybody. Have you met anybody that has caregiving on their bucket list of things to do in life? Hey, do you have anybody that plans to be a caregiver?
No.
Nope.
Nobody plans to do this. We do it out of love, care, and commitment, and I certainly understand there's many people out there who are caring for somebody that they don't love. When we get into it because of the love, care, and commitment. And we share our stories because we know how valuable those are when we hear them.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. When I first started this journey, the business major in me was like, all right, we got to put a business plan together. And so, you go out and you find the statistics, right, to support your case. So for me in the U.S., it was like 54 million caregivers. The AARP had just put out this study, and there's 54 million family caregivers out, on non-paid family caregivers in the U.S. And I said, well, this extends beyond the U.S., and ultimately I've got this big vision for a global sort of solution. I want to help people everywhere. So let me go find the number of global caregivers out there. There is no such number. Nobody has sort of estimated that, at least that I could find in my couple hours of searching. But I tried to sort of do it myself. And if you think about, if you extrapolate from what the U.S. has, and you sort of apply it to a global population, you're talking about 750 million to a billion people out there that sort of
Easily.
are in this same position. That's a massive part of our global society. People that are finding themselves in these situations every single day in every single corner of the world that need that community, that need support, that need to know that they're not the only ones. And that statement alone, to me, is sort of what drives me every day. Is like there's still so many people out there that feel like they're the only one, that they feel alone in this.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is no. Literally, you could probably open up your door, throw a rock, and hit someone who's in a very similar position as you. We just don't have a great way to make that connection or to communicate that.
And you're both creating wonderful systems to help bridge those gaps so that people can find the information that they need so they can make their caregiving experience just a tad bit easier.
And Chris, you're doing it through the airwaves, man.
Well, this is my passion. Finding your niche in this vast network of family caregivers. At least for me, it seems to be talking to wonderful people like yourself and collaborating and sharing our stories. And I think that's where I'm best suited. And I'm just really tickled to death that we're connected and I'm a part of the caregiving.com family again.
Absolutely.
So let's take a break here, and then when I come back, we're going to lighten the conversation up. I'm going to ask both of you, I want to know one fun fact about each of you that I don't know and our listeners really want to hear. You're listening to Healing Ties 2.0. We'll be right back.
Everyone has a story, but not everyone gets the chance to share their story. So, we're going to give you that chance. We want to hear about your story. We want to know how you're creating healing ties in your life and in your community. Email the bow tie guy at healingties.com and indicate if you'd like to be a guest on the show in order to tell your story. To your health, happiness, and prosperity.
Coming up next week on Healing Ties, how are you creating healing ties?
That's such a great question. I think, Chris, one of the things that I've realized perhaps later in my life is that healing ties have really been part of my DNA. And growing up in a society of conflict, I think it placed in my heart a desire to be a healer. And I think one of the ways I've always tried to respond to help people create ties. Right. And I do that presently working with leaders and organizations and helping them embrace the power of their emotions and to be a presence that creates connection.
Hi, everyone. It's Irvin Nugent. I'd like to invite you to the next episode of Healing Ties, where I'll be the guest. In it, we talk about the power of our emotions and how to manage them. We also look at story and storytelling, and we even manage to pay a visit to the pub.
Welcome back, everybody. We're continuing our terrific conversation with Mike and Christina. So who wants to go first? Who wants to give the fun fact first? Don't rush into it.
You got to go first. You got to go first on the last one.
I did. You go first this time. I'll allow it.
Let's see. Fun fact about me. Something that I'm very proud of is I have a very large family. So I have 4 boys of my own. My oldest son is 9. My youngest is 2. So 4 boys in our house. And me and my wife are foster parents as well. So we currently have 2 twins upstairs that we are watching for another friend who's in foster care as well. So we're giving her some respite at the moment. But we've had foster children in and out of the house as well, too. So we can't get enough of them kids.
That is fantastic, Mike.
Yeah, my wife is an amazing woman. I'll lead with that. and she can take on a lot. So we homeschool our children as well too. So she's an amazing person and can handle quite a bit so that I can come down here and do things like this while she manages the house all by herself. But yeah, it's a passion mission project for us. It's one of the things we felt like we could do to give back to the community, especially here in Ohio. Listeners probably don't know that in the United States, especially here in the Midwest, the opioid epidemic has been really devastating to the communities here. And as a result, the need for foster parents in this area is really great. And so as we were thinking about ways that we could give back to the community, we thought, we're okay at this parenting thing. We could probably offer those skills to the community as a way to give back. And so that's how we talked ourselves into opening up some placements.
What a wonderful thing to do. Very good. So, Christina, how are you going to top that?
I'm not. Mine's certainly not.
It's not a competition.
I do.
How dare you pit us against each other, Chris?
Yeah, that was kind of bad, wasn't it?
Mine's just going to be fun. I met the Property Brothers when I was living in Nashville. So again, keeping in mind our international audience, I don't know whether they have HGTV over there or if they air the Property Brothers, but they're a pretty big deal. Still, I think here.
Jonathan and Drew Scott.
Yeah, those handsome boys. My fun story around that. Actually, lumping into that, I also, so on a Friday or Saturday, I got to meet Nick Carter, who was in the Backstreet Boys. I did a meet and greet. He was performing a solo show. And then on Monday, there was just this like random pop-up event. I saw it on Facebook. Hey, we're making a last-minute detour here in Nashville to meet the Property Brothers. And so on Sunday night, I was like, I have to do this. I think they're so cute, especially Jonathan. And I don't know how you can find one twin more attractive than the other, but I do. Let it be known.
Is he like which
He's
one is
the
he?
contractor one.
Oh, yeah, of course.
You know, the flannel wearing,
That's
more
right.
hands-on guy.
Yeah.
Dating Zooey Deschanel, which I just believe he's dating her because he couldn't be with me, since we are, pretty much, we got the glasses and long hair and bangs thing going. But anyway, I was determined to meet them on this Monday, like lunchtime event. I ended up coming down with like flu-like symptoms the morning of. Now, in COVID times, this probably sounds like the worst thing you could do, which was I decided to go, even though I knew I was fluish. But this is my chance to meet them. And given that it was middle of the day, Monday, people are working. I happened to get off work at noon or 1. It was a fairly small group. I remember it being a fairly small group for this meet and greet and then a Q&A after. But that year, my mom was turning 70. So this would have been in maybe April when I met them, and her birthday's in June. So I asked them if they could wish my mom happy birthday, do like a little happy birthday recording video. And they did. And then I was like in the middle of them, and I'm petite, so you can imagine they're like towering over
tall.
me. Yeah. So they start saying happy birthday to you, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end, Jonathan just like abruptly stops and says, your daughter and I are eloping. And then he takes me off camera, and I was like, but are we really though?
Yeah.
I'm ready.
I'm ready. I'm a willing participant in this capture.
Exactly. So that's my fun fact.
That is your fun fact.
And my mom loved it, and all of her friends were like, what? She got to meet them, and they sang you happy birthday? Sheila, that's amazing.
I have a fun fact for Christina. So Christina is also a prolific karaokeer.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to go there too.
Listen,
and yeah,
I've been there live and in person to see it, and it is amazing.
Well, thank you.
When we're able to travel, we're coming to Ohio for a road trip for a karaoke night. We'll pick you up in Dayton, come to Columbus to get Christina.
Yes,
we would
gotta
love
do it.
Nothing more. And yes, big karaoke fan. And shout out to my boyfriend, Benjamin, who has been the one to put in all these fun lights and make our basement really feel like a karaoke lounge.
Oh, this is wonderful. So
what's your go-to karaoke song, Chris? Everybody's got a go-to karaoke song.
My go-to karaoke song, it's a Journey song. Oh, goodness, I'm believing.
Don't Stop Believing.
Don't Stop Believing.
Yeah,
That's
I love
my
that.
go-to. That's my go-to karaoke song.
You'll get a lot of crowd participation in that one. That's what I go for as well. You got to get the crowd singing to overdo the damage I'm putting on the microphone.
It's like, but they're all saying, "What is this bald-headed, white-bearded guy doing singing a Journey song?" And then I say, "That's because they're my era. They all have white beards and bald now too." So.
That's what makes it work. That's what makes it work.
What a great conversation we've had today, and I appreciate both of you sharing a bit about your story. But tell us what's on the horizon for both Caregiving.com and Carely, and let all of our listeners know, especially in the UK, how they can learn more about these two wonderful companies.
Sure. So I would say that I think for us at Caregiving.com, our goal is to really broaden the scope of solutions we offer to caregivers. Like I mentioned, we want to make sure that we've got something for everyone, whether it be content related to their specific situation or just community that they can share and embrace one another in. We want to make sure that we're there for them. We've always had our sights set on global solution, so connecting to people wherever they are with the solution that they need that's relevant to them. I do foresee us sort of making our way across the pond with some much more specific content for different settings in Europe and the UK. So look on the lookout for that stuff. And then likewise, I mentioned we are a technology company at heart, so you're going to see a lot of work and effort being put into sort of the innovation side of Caregiving.com. We really want to make that a product more than just a sort of static website. Mm-hmm. Being able to create a profile to make the site work for you as a caregiver is something I think I see in the near future for us, and really making sure that the site can deliver on a really elevated experience without the user having to really put in a lot of effort. I think that's sort of that automation component is really what we want to see happen. And I think, Christina, on the editorial side, we've got a lot coming up, right?
Yeah, just trying to do our best to address all aspects of the caregiving experience. So we're always, as I mentioned at the top of the show, working with our contributors and our internal team on just always keeping the site fresh with new content. So the particular timing of this, we're looking at Mental Health Month, I believe is May. And so we're going to be focusing topics or content around that. And then June here in the U.S. is Pride Month, focusing on the LGBTQ caregiving experience. So Chris, I'm sure we'll be
I might
in
have
touch.
A little experience there.
I think actually that project in particular, we see a really great opportunity for us to hopefully partner with some pretty big organizations, see if we can't get the conversation going to not only help us with collecting stories, those caregiving stories, but hopefully, more importantly, data. We see a really great opportunity for us to collect data on the LGBTQ experience, in particular, transgender caregiving. That came to light in some recent email communications I had, and was told we don't really have information about that. And I thought,
very hard to
there's
find
a gap.
that information.
See,
I'd be happy to be a part of that.
Yeah.
So, Christina and Mike, with the great work that you're doing and the care that you're providing, you are certainly two people who are creating healing ties all around us. I can't thank you enough for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
I hope you enjoyed our delightful conversation with Mike and Christina today, and I encourage you to visit Carely.com and Caregiving.com to learn more about the great work Mike and Christina and the entire staff are doing to assist caregivers across the globe. Well, that does it for this episode of Healing Ties, featured on the Whole Care Network and UK Health Radio. And if you'd like to share your story on Healing Ties, email me direct at thebowtieguy@healingties.com. We would love to share your story. As you know, I'm your presenter and host, Christopher McClellan. I've created a life to love after caregiving ends by being with awesome people like you. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to Healing Ties wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. We'll see you for another episode of Healing Ties real soon. Bye for now.